So my name is Tom Peters. I'm the Dean of Library Services here at Missouri State University. I want to welcome everyone to this author talk and book signing. This is volume 3, the final volume, at least as far as we know, of Dr. Brooks Blevins' magisterial recording book series about, you threw me off there, Craig, of the Ozarks, which I think, humbly, try not to predict the future, but I think this is going to be the standard history of the Ozarks for many years to come. Brooks is the Noel Boyd Professor of Ozarks Studies here at Missouri State University. I learned earlier that Noel Boyd was a local banker who left some money to endow this chair, this position, this faculty position. So Brooks is a very esteemed member of our MSU faculty. 2 quick stories about Brooks, personal stories. I've been here 10 years. One of the first things I did when I got here, I needed to learn more about the Ozarks. That was my goal. How am I going to achieve that goal? I started reading Brooks Blevins' books and learned a lot about the Ozarks. So I don't know if you even knew that, but I'm eternally grateful for the orientation that your books provided to me about Ozarks history and life. And I've enjoyed, I think I've reviewed every volume of the 3-volume set that we're celebrating here today. And then just recently, Brooks did some research that was near and dear to my heart that proved beyond a reasonable doubt, I would say, in a court of law and in front of you all, that the impetus for the Grand Ole Opry came from a house on the Missouri-Ozark border. And so whenever the Ozark Opry people down talk the Ozarks as not really the Upland South or not really of interest musically, their whole existence belongs to Ozarks music. And the house was, it gets better. The house was right on the border, state line road between Missouri and Arkansas, and it was on the Missouri side of the road. Oh. So how good does that get? So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Brooks Blevins.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for giving away my surprise there with your story. No, I wasn't going to talk about that at all, but that is my current little kind of fun diversionary project that I find myself in between book projects. I always stumble upon some kind of fun something. Not that the books aren't fun, but something that just occupies my time for a few months, and then I get to do it and move on to something else. And that's what I've been doing lately. So it's and I think I'll be talking about that in February at the Friends of the Archives, Greene County Archives meeting. So if anybody's interested in listening to the untold story of the origins of the Grand Ole Opry, I'll be telling you the whole story there. Thanks, Tom and the Ozarks Studies Institute people for having me over here. It's really exciting to have this Ozark Room to start with. I usually, every time I'm in the library, I try to come by here and just look at the books and stuff. It's nice to have this here, and it's nice to be in here talking to you folks about the history of the Ozarks. Before I get started, I wanted to, I have a couple of my colleagues from the history department here. I am a historian, even though my title doesn't necessarily indicate that. And one of the fun things about doing this trilogy and about being here at Missouri State in the first place was the deep history that we have with Ozarks history. Really the scholarly study of the Ozarks is embedded in the history of this institution. This is really where it starts and where it gets its momentum going back in the 1970s and 80s with the old OSI, the Ozarks Studies Institute. Did I get that right? And I called you guys the Ozark Studies Institute. You're not, are you? Well, the other one was called something else, and I can't think of what it is now. It was called something else, but I can't think of it now. But It really started here at Missouri State. And when I got here, even though I'm the person who teaches Ozarks history, I discovered that several of my colleagues had done projects that had to do with the history of the Ozarks. And in these 3 volumes at different points, especially in this 3rd volume, I was able to cite the work of my colleagues. Tom Dickey is back there. Kathleen Kennedy's in the acknowledgments, I think, though I don't think I cited anything. Thornton Miller had written about the Hickok-Tut shootout on the Springfield Square. Holly Baggett about LGBTQ issues in the Ozarks, and I got to cite her work. Jeremy Neely with his work on the Civil War era in Western Missouri, and I'm probably leaving somebody. Tom Dickey wrote about the tomato canning industry and tomato farming industry here in the Ozarks, and so I really was excited. Mara Cohen is here, and I got to draw from her work on the history of Jewish people in the Ozarks. And so there was a lot of stuff out here already, and it was nice to be able to draw on a lot of these colleagues. Steve McIntyre was one that I forgot to mention, who has written a lot about the labor history of the Ozarks. So a lot of this stuff, a lot of the work had already been done for me, and I just had to bring it together and put it together. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm not going to go all through the book. There's a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff that probably not everyone will be interested in, but there's so many different topics in here that you'll probably find something you're interested in. There's agriculture, and there's race, and there's religion, and there's the Great Depression and World War II and tourism and all kinds of stuff. But at the heart of this volume 3 is really the idea of image and stereotype. And if you came for Curtis Copeland's talk a few weeks ago, you got an introduction to that, kind of the hillbilly stereotypes of the Ozarks. And that's really that's the theme that runs throughout this book. And that's really the reason that we're here in the first place, that Missouri State University, old Southwest Missouri State University, became the center for studying the Ozarks. It was because of the interest that had been built up by folklorists and travel writers and local color writers and all these people who had painted this image, this very colorful, appealing image of what the rural Ozarks was, who the Ozarkers were. And I have spent much of my career refuting big chunks of that image, but I also realized that if it wasn't there to start with, no one would care anything about my refutation of the image. So it's kind of a fine line. You need, as Todd Parnell knows, one of the things we talk about in Ozark study is this idea of exceptionalism or anti-exceptionalism. And you need the exceptional to exist out there. You need someone arguing for the exceptional if you're going to argue for the anti-exceptional side of things. And so it's so you have to be careful biting the hand that feeds you. Sometimes we know that a lot of what we do, a lot of this enterprise of studying the Ozarks or any region or any marginal group of people in any way depends on the fact that we've built up this image of those people that scholars then come along and spend time chipping away at. And so what I'm going to talk about today, just a couple of things. Let's see. Oh, I'm punching the wrong thing. Did I go too far? Yep, there. Just really quickly, in the early 1900s, the social construct of the Ozarks is developed by fiction writers, by travel writers, by folklorists. And this is really the first time that we get a people that we know as the Ozarkers, or the people of the Ozarks. In the 18th century and the 19th century, you've got the physical place that we know as the Ozark Plateau or the Ozark Uplift. It existed. It's been around for a long time, a lot longer than any of us. But we really didn't think about the people who lived in this place as a unique and separate and other population of people. They were just an appendage of the South or the Midwest or wherever you wanted to put them. They're just people who happen to live in the Ozarks. But in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you get the development of this, what we call a social construct of the Ozarks, this image, this idea that the reading American populace has of what the Ozarks is. When somebody says Ozarks, automatically these stereotypes, these ideas come to mind. And a lot of them have to do with moonshine and feuding and the later dog patch ideas, the floppy hats and bare feet and hound dogs and that kind of stuff. We all know that image, even though it's less relevant now than it's ever been, we can still tap into that image and we know that that's out there. And again, that image is what spurs all that interest in the Ozarks in the first place. It's what keeps this enterprise going in a lot of ways. A lot of that comes about because of the work of local color novelists and short story writers, the most famous, of course, being Harold Bell Wright, who publishes The Shepherd of the Hills in 1907. It becomes if they had bestsellers back then, it would have been a bestseller. It really creates the Branson tourism industry. If you're a newcomer to Southwest Missouri, you may not realize that tourism is not a recent development in Branson. It's been around for more than a century now. And a lot of it started out as literary tourism, people coming to Southwest Missouri to see this Ozarks and these Ozarkers that Harold Bell Wright writes about. These kind of people who are somehow fundamentally different than mainstream American people. And they're worth coming to the Ozarks to try to get a glimpse of them. The old hillbilly hunt somewhere in southern Missouri. By the 1920s and 30s, you get folklorists and travel writers who are coming into the region who are really shaping that image of the Ozarks and defining the Ozarks for an American reading public. And chief among those is the guy pictured there, that's Vance Randolph. Randolph was just from barely outside the Ozarks, from Pittsburgh, Kansas. But he was from off, as we say, and he came into Southwest Missouri originally and ended up in Northwest Arkansas and wrote books and books and books. He made his living as a writer, and much of the stuff he wrote, you will never know because he did it under assumed names, and he was writing all the time. That's how he survived. That and marrying women who could support him to some degree. That was his other strategy that he had. But Randolph, he really crafts this image, this kind of romantic backwoods image of the Ozarks. And he was honest about this. He told people, I'm not interested in the folks who live in the towns. He didn't give a hoot about Springfield. He didn't give a hoot about Fayetteville or Joplin or places like that. He was interested in the people who lived on the ridges and in the hollers and in the back hills, the people who were the real Ozark people to him, the ones who had the folk songs and the folk tales and the folk ways that he was excited about and that he wrote about and that he told America about. And in the process, he painted this very, very romantic image of a backward place, but in his mind, a good backward place. It was a good kind of backwardness because Randolph was a nonconformist. He was even in many ways an anti-capitalist. And he saw these people as kind of going against the grain of America in the 1920s and the 1930s and representing an alternative lifestyle, even though most Ozarkers, even in those days, didn't live exactly like he portrayed them to be living. But that's how a place becomes a people. That's how this social construct of the Ozarks really catches on. And then I skip ahead. One of the fun things I like to do in the book was look at dates and talk about and kind of name eras and things like that. If you think about if you listened to the news or saw the news on TV, or if you're the one person left who read a newspaper today, I think they're still around. I'm pretty sure they are. Then you know this is the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the United States' entry into World War II. But in my book, 1941 was the year of the Ozarks. And it was 80 years ago to 1941. 80 years before 1941 was, any math majors? 1861, the year the Civil War started. So it's kind of a neat divide there. You go from the Civil War era to World War II to today in these equal jumps. And the reason I called 1941 the year of the Ozarks in my book is that because of the work of people like Vance Randolph and these other folklorists and travel writers who were crafting this very appealing image of a romantic, sort of simple people living in the backcountry in a time of great economic distress, the greatest economic depression in American history, the Ozarks becomes a really hot commodity in the 1930s. And it all kind of reaches a crescendo in 1941. In the year 1941, you had the release of the Technicolor version of The Shepherd of the Hills, the John Wayne movie version. If you've only watched the John Wayne movie version and you've never read the novel, you have no idea what the novel is about. Because that got the Hollywood treatment for sure. And a lot of people got their backs up over it here in Southwest Missouri. Hollywood turning the Matthewses into moonshiners. How in the world could you do that? But that's what they did in that movie. But it was released in 41, a big hit movie. The feller who's here in the middle, anybody recognize that guy? No, but yeah, Huey he was gone by then. But that's Bob Burns. Bob Burns was at that time, he was a famous comedian. He was from Northwest Arkansas, and his radio show, the Arkansas Traveler, launched in 1941. Bob Burns had been Bing Crosby's sidekick for many years on radio and in the movies. And so he was basically a hillbilly comedian. He was kind of Jeff Foxworthy for the World War II era. And that's the kind of jokes that he told folks back in the Ozarks, his kin folks back home. So that was all over pop culture. The Weaver brothers and Elviry from here in Southwest Missouri, they released not one, but 3 films in 1941. As you can imagine, the production values weren't just super duper, and they weren't Technicolor. But the Weaver brothers and Elviry were very popular with rural audience and small town audiences across the United States. And they always portrayed rural Ozarks people in their movies, or almost always did. That was their shtick. They had been vaudeville country kind of hillbilly performers, and they transferred that onto film. So you could catch 3 Ozark themed movies just from the Weaver brothers and Elviry alone that year. That was the same year that the play Made in the Ozarks launched in Los Angeles. It would eventually march its way eastward across the continent and open on Broadway after World War II, and quickly get shut down on Broadway after World War II. It was apparently a terrible play, and was lowbrow even by Tobacco Road standards. And this is, but again, this was, people were interested in the region. The reason I have a baseball picture up there, and that is not Bill Verdon. He was not playing at that time. Preacher Rowe was probably still in the minors, struggling around in 41. The guy behind the plate is Mickey Owen from Nixa, from Christian County. Yeah, Mickey. 41 was really a legendary year in Major League Baseball. That was the year that Joe DiMaggio hit in 56 consecutive games. That was the last time that a major leaguer hit over 400. Ted Williams hit over 400 that year. But at the end of the season, the guy who was most remembered out of all of those was a guy from the Ozarks, a catcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers named Mickey Owen. And it's because of his muff that he made on what would have been the last strike of the game. It was game 4 of the World Series. The Dodgers had never won the World Series, and they were playing their crosstown rivals, the Yankees, back in the days when they were in the same city. And the Yankees, of course, were still the Yankees back in those days, just like they are now. And the Dodgers were just about to tie the series at 2 games apiece. Tommy Henrich was at bat, and he swung and missed on what would have been the 3rd strike in the 9th inning and the last out of the game, but Mickey Owen missed it. And if you know your baseball rules, as long as that catcher doesn't catch it, you can run to first. And if you get to first before he throws it down to first, you're safe. And that's what happened. Tommy Henrich made it to first base. The Yankees rallied and won the game and went up 3-1 instead of being tied 2-2. They won the next game. All the momentum that this time was on the Yankees side. They won the next game. And it would be many years, I think 14 years, does that sound right? Before the Dodgers won their first 55, I think is when they won their first, the year after Preacher retired. Yeah, he didn't get the win. Yeah. They needed old lefty to leave town to win the World Series. But this was kind of the play of 1941 as a guy from the Ozarks. What's even weirder about this is that the pitching hero for the Yankees in that game was a guy from the Ozarks, the guy from Rolla, Missouri, named Marv Babyface Brewer. He had come in relief in the 6th inning and shut the Dodgers down for 3 consecutive innings to set up that come from behind win by the Yankees. Nobody remembers Marv Babyface Brewer today. He didn't have a very long career, but it was an interesting fact that the hero and the GOAT from that same game were both from Southern Missouri, both from the Ozarks. So 1941 became even more the year of the Ozarks. And it was that same year that publishers released 3 nationally reviewed books about the Ozarks. People were fascinated with the Ozarks in 1941. Take to the Hills was written by a Chicago newspaper columnist who moved to Southern Missouri as a back to the lander and wrote stories about her and her husband's life in Southern Missouri. Yesterday Today was written by a New Deal social worker who did not have such a rosy view of the Ozarks, but that gave us an alternative look at the sort of poor backwoods Ozarks. And then Ozark Country by Otto Ernst Rayburn came out the first week of December in 1941, just days before Pearl Harbor. And it was the sort of going to be the magnum opus of Rayburn's career and of looking at the Ozarks. And just a few days later, of course, the year of the Ozarks ceased to be the year of the Ozarks when Pearl Harbor was bombed. People were not worried about regions and colorful personalities from the backwoods. The Ozarks quickly disappeared into the ether and really would not pop back up, at least until Ma and Paul Kettle came along, and probably even until the Beverly Hillbillies came along in the 1960s, would you see a real resurgence in pop cultural interest in the Ozarks. But the year of the Ozarks, 1941, that was the same year that this fellow was born, Junior Cobb. And some of you probably have heard of Junior Cobb. You may remember him. But the reason I mentioned Junior Cobb is that he becomes sort of a totem for the Ozarks in the post-World War II era. He becomes really a symbolic figure for the Ozarks. Junior Cobb was an uneducated wood carver from northern Arkansas that Peter Engler from Silver Dollar City discovered when Cobb was in his early 20s. Peter Engler was the head wood carver for many, many years down at Silver Dollar City. And he started bringing Cobb's creations back to Silver Dollar City to sell. And Cobb became a regional sensation and for a time, even sort of a national sensation. He, one of the Silver Dollar City employees ghost wrote a review of the Beverly Hillbillies by Junior Cobb in TV Guide in 1963. Junior Cobb was probably illiterate, but he was later featured on the Glenn Campbell Show, a nationally broadcast show in the late 60s, the country music hero. He made a visit to the White House. His artwork was displayed in the Smithsonian, and there were magazine articles written about him in the region and around the country, this plain country guy who really only worked when he ran out of money. He admitted that when people would come and interview him, his wife would make him come back and carve when they needed food or something. I mean, that was kind of the life that they lived. But I used Junior Cobb in the book as that totem, that symbol of the Ozarks, because that's what people around the nation in the 1960s and 70s wanted the Ozarks to be. They wanted that sort of simple, naive lifestyle that was somehow separated from all the cultural turmoil going on with the civil rights movement and all the various other movements, cultural movements that are coming up in the late 60s and early 70s, with the imminent threat of nuclear annihilation always looming over us. And it was kind of a salve for people to think about someone like Junior Cobb just living their life, a nonconformist, doing what he wanted to do. If he decided one morning he gets up and he wants to go out and hunt arrowheads, then I'm going to spend the day hunting arrowheads until my wife tells me to get to work. That's what I'm going to do. And so Junior Cobb becomes this sort of Ozarker symbol for the nation. And I thought it was interesting that he was born in 1941, the year of the Ozarks. It's only interesting because I made that up as the year of the Ozarks, but I had already made that up before I discovered he was born there. So there is a little bit of synergy going on there. Junior Cobb lives a full life in the Jewish biblical sense of a full life, 70 years, and he dies in 2011, in late 2011. And I end this by talking about a development that happens recently, and happens the very year that Junior Cobb dies. So we're sticking with these kind of years and things that happen in these various years. Does anybody know what happened on 11/11/11 in Northwest Arkansas? That was the day Crystal Bridges, there might have been an ice storm, but Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art opened that day. A very different kind of museum and a very different kind of art than Junior Cobb was known for. A very much more highbrow sort of art than Junior Cobb was known for, and one that would not be considered vernacular in a place where almost all artwork was vernacular before 2011. But Alice Walton and the Walton Foundation and the Walton family opened this massive museum of American art that dwarfed any other museum of American art. They took artwork from the citadels in New York and Philadelphia and Boston and everywhere else that she could find artwork, and brought it to Northwest Arkansas. And one of the things I noticed immediately after that was that the Ozarks starts being rebranded in 2011. If you go back and look at a lot of the magazine articles that come out beginning about 2011, around the time of the Crystal Bridges opening, there are articles about Northwest Arkansas, and there are articles about the sort of modern and hip elements of Springfield, Missouri. There are articles that talk about these kind of hip boutique hotels and bistros and spas and all this kind of stuff, places that are perfect for selfies and unisex bathrooms and all these kind of things. And it's very much as if the Ozarks is finally being welcomed into the United States in 2011 and afterward. By Vogue sends a reporter to the Ozarks, and that's when I just almost passed out when I realized that Vogue featured a feature story on the Ozarks, and it was nothing like the generations of feature stories that had appeared in magazines before. There was nobody in overalls, there were no coon hunters, there was nary a mule in any of those pictures. And it was sort of the modern hip Ozarks, and this is why you should come visit it. But that very much is a change that we've seen. It's a change that was going on well before 2011 came along, but it's one that the nation sort of catches up on thanks to Alice Walton and her work at Crystal Bridges. And Here is Crystal. It's a beautiful place. If you haven't been there, it's definitely worth a visit. And I've been several times, and I guess they're back open. I'm not really sure. They're back open, and but it's certainly worth a visit. The very next year, though, in an attempt to restore equilibrium, a local named Joe Wilson founded the first World Championship Squirrel Cook-Off in Bentonville, on the square where Sam Walton had his five and dime all those years, and where Alice Walton grew up. And he even said to the press, this is to remind locals that they still live in the Ozarks. So before we get too big for our britches, before we get too modernized and too hip, we're still in the Ozarks, folks. But that's really been kind of the story of the 21st century, is a rebranding of parts of the Ozarks, a demographic change that has happened in these very same parts of the Ozarks. Today, there are school districts in Northwest Arkansas that 30 years ago were 95% or more white that are majority non-white today. There are school districts in Southwest Missouri that are approaching majority non-white today. A lot of that has to do with the poultry processing industry and the in-migration of people of Hispanic descent, and Asians and Africans. The Marshallese in Northwest Arkansas has the largest population of Marshall Islanders outside the Marshall Islands. And so that's all part of this change that has taken place in the Ozarks as well. And Walmart itself has carried out not only a financial revolution in Northwest Arkansas, making Benton County, Arkansas, one of the most affluent counties in all of Middle America, but also a demographic change by pressuring vendors and corporations from around the world to set up offices in Northwest Arkansas to deal directly with Walmart. And all of these people have come in, and Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims, and has really helped change the face of Northwest Arkansas. So today we still have sort of in many ways, a bifurcated Ozarks. You've got these places that have changed tremendously, that are affluent, that are demographically diverse, and you still have large swaths of the Ozarks where things haven't changed all that much, and where poverty is still very much a part of the society. There are large stretches of the Ozarks that the government would label persistent poverty counties, counties that decade after decade after decade have populations that are 20% or more below the poverty line. And so that's still part of the Ozarks. So as I say in the book, there is no one story to tell about the Ozarks. It is still in many ways a microcosm of the American story. It has its own riffs, but the melody line is very similar to the U.S. story, just with a regional flavor to it. And that's the Ozarks that I've been writing about for the last few years. And who knows what it's going to look like 30 years from now, or 70 years from now, or whenever. But that's sort of the lay of the land as we have it now. And I think that old Ozarks that Harold Bell Wright and Vance Randolph helped define all those decades ago, it's dying away. The stereotypes are still out there, but they're not nearly as popular and relevant as they once were. We're in the middle of a real change in the Ozarks, and we'll see which direction it goes. And with that, I'll be glad to. Do we have time for questions? Yeah. Well, you can. Yeah. Right. Right. Well, Benton County is. Yeah, that's good. That's right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the question is specific to my comment about Benton County being an affluent county in northwest Arkansas, is does that area or the margins of that area still have poverty? And I would say Benton County, you're still going to find poor people in Benton County, but they are a very, very small percentage of the population today. Now, the farther you get away from that hearth area of northwest Arkansas, here's the thing. The farther you get away from Springfield and the farther you get away from northwest Arkansas City, which is Fayetteville to Bentonville, Bella Vista, that stretch, the poorer the Ozarks gets, the more rural it gets, the fewer opportunities you see, and the farther you have to drive to take advantage of those opportunities. And so in northwest Arkansas, poverty is, there are poor people everywhere, but poverty is not one of the concerns of northwest Arkansas, just as it really isn't as much in a place like Greene County, especially a place like Christian County, which has become the affluent suburb of Springfield. Yeah, well, I think there are fewer people out there peddling that. All you have to do is go to Branson today. If you remember Branson from 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, the hillbilly image is much less prominent in modern day Branson than it used to be. And I don't know, it's probably a chicken or egg question. Do entrepreneurs quit peddling that because the public in general loses interest in that? Or did they just decide to quit peddling that and the public just sort of goes along with it? I don't really know. I do think we probably have less an appetite now for hillbilly stereotype. And a lot of that, I think, is just because we're a much more diverse nation than we were even 30 years ago. If you think about it, the hillbilly figure, and the hillbilly figure was almost always a white figure. It's a poor white. It's basically just poor whites who, in the case of a hillbilly, happens to live in the hills, even though most people around the country don't really pay attention to that last part. It's just poor white people. But if you think about it, that was always a symbol, whether romantic or otherwise, of the others. Those were American others in a day when we didn't really pay attention to Black people or people of color of any kind. And so you had this other group who just happens to be white people who missed the boat somehow when it came to success and affluence in America. And we don't need them anymore. I mean, we have, if you're talking about celebrating diversity or of any kind, economic or racial or ethnic or religious or whatever it is, we don't need to talk about those folks anymore because we have plenty of examples of diversity in American society today that we can talk about. And so I think in many ways the hillbilly has kind of run its course. It's just not an appealing thing to a large percentage of the population out there today.
Well, to add to that discussion, I would like to get take on whether or not there may still be prejudice toward people from the Ozarks in academia. This happened, granted, over 40 years ago, but my father was a professor at Georgia. Editorial piece, if you will, that got published in the Upstart Crow, which was, and he was invited to this symposium, and the head guy thanks my dad for his presentation of his paper and whatnot. But at the very end there, he said, much more of these sort of things if you would make sure that you lose that hillbilly accent.
Yeah.
A little bit of that going on.
Yeah. The question is about question of is there still prejudice against Ozarkers or kind of the the hillbilly stereotype specifically in academia, and also I think there's probably a second question in there: is there still prejudice against accents that don't meet the mainstream accent, which I think the latter is probably more true of the former. I think there still is, and I don't think it's necessarily a conscious prejudice, but there have been studies that have shown that people with Southern accents are just assumed to be dumber than people with non-Southern accents in the United States. Or not all of us who have Southern accents talk slow. If you got the double whammy going on, then you're just in trouble. But as far as the first one goes, I don't see that as much now. And I know your dad, Wayne Holmes, lived and taught in a different era when that was probably more the case. But if you think about it, especially in the humanities and social sciences, where I'm most familiar and where he circulated around, there really is no mainstream anymore. In history, for instance, since the 1960s and 70s, the birth of ethnic studies and new social history, and what we've done, we've concentrated on all these formerly marginal and ignored groups, and there's somebody writing about almost everybody now, and probably more people are writing about formerly marginalized people than are writing about the politicians and the generals and the folks that most of the history used to be written about. So we've had a real atomization of history and other disciplines where people are, we're just doing really, a lot of people are doing these micro studies, as we call them now, case studies that really look at segments of the population that just were not written about in the 30s and 40s and 50s and even in the 60s. And certainly Ozarks Studies, Ozarks history falls squarely into that, and so I think now there's, to answer your question, I don't think that you see that much prejudice against, say, somebody who studies the Ozarks or Appalachia or the Delta, or somebody who studies some marginalized group as you once did, because almost all of us are studying some marginalized group nowadays.
And what started him and he went into there. He found his life's work by studying other people, other marginalized people.
Right. Yeah. I don't know that I would, I would place Al Cap in the position of champion of the marginalized, but according to some stories, he may have only spent one day in Appalachia, but that is true, and certainly he had his own uses for hillbilly characters, and that was in satire to poke fun at the moneyed elite that he resented in the Northeast.
Springfield in 81, and Branson had a big boom, and I was hired to come back to Springfield.
Yeah, the question is about Branson tourism, the boom, and then we won't call it a bust, but decline. And I guess first of all, the Chamber of Commerce may ask you to leave again if you have anything to do with this, you know, it booms after you move away. And then, but no, I write about this in the book because, you know, what do you, if you don't write about the boom times of Branson in the third volume of this book, what are you going to write about? Because it's certainly one of the chief stories of the Ozarks. I think it was just a moment in time that probably will not be recaptured. And the actual full bore boom was pretty short lived. You're talking about just a few years in the 90s when everyone was convinced that this is the next Orlando, this is you know, Vegas by Billy Graham, you know, that kind of thing. And that, you know, really, and I write about this in the book. I'm a big Simpsons fan, and Branson just charges into the pop cultural universe in 1996 when Bart and his buddies take a road trip to Branson and go to the Andy Williams Theater and really exciting stuff. And but by that time, by 96, Branson was already leveling out a little bit, and the peak was over. And I don't know exactly, I don't know exactly what happened in there. I know that people like Wayne Newton didn't stay very long. Johnny Cash started building a theater and didn't finish it. Who knows how Branson would have been different. I mean, that may have sunk Branson right there when the Man in Black pulls out and decides this place is a little square for me. You know, that's probably not a good sign. And so by 96, a lot of those really Willie Nelson, Merle Haggard, the people who not only had money and fame, but also some kind of street cred, you know, they're starting to pull out of there. And so Branson eventually, what I say in the book is that Branson today is what Branson was 40 years ago without the local acts. You know, you go back 40 years before Roy Clark comes to town, almost all the theaters were by Ozarks people. They were by families, the Presleys, the Mabes, the Plumbers, the Wilkinsons, all these other families that were natives of the region. They all basically had the same formula. You know, they're playing bluegrass, they're playing country, little gospel, Star Spangled Banner every once in a while, and they got a hillbilly comedian. And once the big dogs come to town, that they slowly get smothered out to the point now where Presley's is the only one left on the strip down there. As far as I know, they're still going to open up next year. And so so what you got now is just, you've got a Branson that's really returned to a regional attraction. It's middle American people within driving distance who come to Branson, and you don't have the really big name acts that you used to have, and you don't have local people for the most part anymore. So that's been the change in Branson. Yeah. And we'd probably just import everybody from Nashville if we did that. Hey, Tom.
Hey, so you mentioned about how
Yeah.
Winter's bone.
Right. The question is, in sort of the wake of the decline of the hillbilly stereotype, is Ozarks noir, is that the next thing that's going to be sort of the brand for our region nationwide? And certainly there have been signs of that. Winter's Bone, probably the best example of that, both the terrific novel by Daniel Woodrell and the terrific film by Deborah Granick that came out just a couple of years after the novel. And certainly that's a sort of gritty look at the underbelly of the Ozarks. It's not, the literature and the filmmaking is certainly not the same as the literature and filmmaking from earlier eras in Ozarks history. My class, my Ozarks literature class just this afternoon finished watching the 2005 Billy Bob Thornton movie Crystal, which is a very dark, very Ozarks noir kind of thing, where you start to wonder if there's a paved road anywhere in the Ozarks. But so I think that's a good point that Dr. Peters brings up, that there's always going to be something to replace it. We've got the Netflix show Ozark Now, which I'm a fan of. Filmed in Georgia. That's that's right. That's Georgia beat Missouri to the punch when it comes to being friendly to Hollywood folks. No, it's not moonshiners, but it is drugs. Yeah, it's modern drugs. Crystal was about marijuana. You had meth in Winter's Bone, and they're doing heroin or whatever. I don't know what they're doing. They're laundering money, and they're dealing with modern, Mexican drug cartels in Ozark. So at least we're advancing with the times. That's one of the things in the Ozarks. A lot of the city people and the town people in the Ozarks are always worried about our image in the nation and afraid that we're behind the times. In terms of drug running, we're right there. I mean, we're keeping up with anybody. Yeah, and dealing, and it's international because we're dealing with the Mexican drug cartels. So that's but yeah, that's a good point. And I don't know if you think about it. The film Winter's Bone comes out one year, and then Crystal Bridges opens up the very next year. And you've got these sort of clashing images of the Ozarks. And in many ways, I would say that, at least in terms of national exposure and national coverage, the Crystal Bridges image is holding its own in recent years. I really think it is. And it may just be because after Winter's Bone, everybody's afraid to actually go into the rural Ozarks. So who knows what's going on out there. Yeah. But for my purposes, that's good business, as long as Hollywood is still interested and still wants to have these kind of stereotypical portrayals of the Ozarks. Then it's just stuff for me to talk about and write about. Yeah. Are we about out of time? We got time for another question? Okay.
I didn't know about the Ozarks, even though I knew about all the phenomena that you mentioned. In terms of national images, so when I've talked to other people, my own impression was that the idea of this region as middle America, whatever that means, has replaced largely with a hillbilly stereotype. And is used by Charles Murray in his "If You Live in a Bubble" survey to figure out.
Yeah, of course, in recent years, especially in wake of the release of the book Hillbilly Elegy, a lot of the talk has turned, and because of the 2016 election, a lot of the talk has pivoted around toward politics. And if you look at where the Ozark stands in terms of politics in comparison to the rest of America, then certainly we've become a solidly red block. The last time that any county anywhere in the Ozarks voted for a Democrat in a presidential election was 2008. And there were a couple of them who voted for Obama that year. But since then, we've been solidly red and getting redder in many ways. And I think what that points to is that the Ozarks does, as you're saying, and the question was about, and I'm going to say the question now, 2 minutes into my answer, since I just remembered that. But it's a question about the image of the Ozarks and how it relates to kind of a middle American image today. I think that's what you're getting at. And I think what that political map points to is that rural America in general has more in common with rural America than we do with the coasts and with big metropolitan areas. And so I think the Ozarks is less unique in many ways than it's ever been. And a lot of that is just because we now have lived in a full century with radio, and we've lived more than a biblical lifetime with television. And we have all these things that create these pockets of sameness, around the United States, regardless of where you live. And I think the Ozarks is very much part and parcel of whatever it means to be rural American today. And that doesn't mean that, that everybody out there living in rural America is, are somewhere on the far right. But it just means that, if you look at the political map, if you think about it in terms of cultural and social ideas, then, we have a lot more in common with rural places in Utah and Alabama and Ohio than we do with St. Louis and with Kansas City. And to a certain degree, I guess you could say that's always been the case in a state like Missouri.
Our natural resources, and it's always been quality as an economic development issue in the Ozarks, both Arkansas and here, is an important relationship. Is that something that could help carry us into another image?
Well, it's if anything, it's maybe the kind of thing that's going to get even more people to come here, to the point where maybe we don't want them coming here. And I think that I think if there is a difference between, say, the Ozarks and much of the rest of rural America, it is the physical beauty and the enticements that the Ozarks has to offer. And you can look at demographic maps in lots of rural places around the country, northern Missouri being an example of that, and populations continue to decline. In most places in the Ozarks, they haven't. Population, even in rural counties in the Ozarks, population grows because people want to come here. People want to live in the Ozarks. It's a pretty place to live. It's a cheap place to live. We've got a lot of water. We've got a lot of wildlife. There are a lot of trees here. There are lots of things to be said for the Ozarks and for a place like Appalachia that places like Iowa and Nebraska, don't, these traditional farming belt rural communities don't have, and they're hemorrhaging population. And a lot of those people are coming here. And so I think that's part of our story as well. And just there's no way to know this if you use back road, but I can take you back road sometime. And even today, most of the people on the Ozarks back roads are not what we would consider real Ozarkers. They're from somewhere else. They've come in from in my home community where I grew up in Arkansas. There's when they decided to name the roads a few years ago, we never had road names till the 21st century. You just kind of know where you're supposed to go. If you can't find your way, you don't need to be out here. That was always the kind of thing. When they decided to name the roads, they named the gravel road that I grew up on a Blevins Road, not because we were a big important political family, because we were the only native family left on that road. Everybody else had left and had been replaced by newcomers from Chicago and Wisconsin and Ohio and Mississippi and California and that's one of the stories that a lot of people don't realize about the modern rural Ozarks, is that the people that we were writing about and that Branson was trying to make hay off of years ago, those people for the most part are outnumbered now. Even out in the back country, they're outnumbered because the Ozarks is such an attractive place for a broad swath of American society. from all angles and all parts of the political spectrum. People come from everywhere to be here. And you know, the natives are few and far between, just like they are in Branson. They're getting to be that way everywhere. Yeah. And I think we may be out of time,
I
probably.
think we're out of time. I
Yeah.
think we should wrap it up.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brooks. Your comments about radio were spot on, and then you followed up with a comment about Iowa hemorrhaging population. That struck
I
me right in the chest.
I did that on purpose.
I'm part of the problem, not part of the solution. So,
Yeah, you
we
got out
do
of there.
have books for sale. I think Brooks has proven to us that he can read, he can speak, and I'm pretty sure he can write. So he might autograph some of it.
Not neatly, but I can sign my name.
And we do have
the
some help yourself to cookies and coffee and water and conversation. So join me in thanking Brooks Blevins for a wonderful talk.
Thanks.